Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into cults and manipulation.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, so we've got a pretty interesting mix of sources for this one.
Right.
We've got some academic research, personal accounts, historical case studies.
Yeah, a little bit of everything. It's
Yeah,
going to be a good
I'm
one.
excited.
Yeah.
Basically, we're trying to understand how these groups actually function, like how cults work,
Right.
the dangers that they pose,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
the tactics that manipulators use
It's fascinating stuff.
to exert control over people.
Yeah,
You with me?
absolutely. And I think one of the things that we really need to emphasize is that this exists on a spectrum.
Okay.
We're going to be exploring those extreme cases like cults,
So,
but we're also going to be looking at how these tactics show up in everyday life,
okay.
like in ways that we might not even realize.
That's a good point, yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess the first thing we got to do is define what we're even talking about. What makes a group a cult?
Yeah.
Is it just about having, like, unconventional beliefs or something?
No, it goes far beyond just beliefs.
Okay.
A really interesting tool that we have for evaluating groups like this is something called the Bonewitz Cult Danger Scale.
Interesting.
This scale really looks at a lot of different factors, like how the group is structured internally, their dogma, how they recruit new members,
Right.
if there's any kind of financial exploitation going on,
Wow.
and even if they endorse things like violence.
So it's not just about, like, weird rituals or outlandish beliefs. It's really about
Right.
the power structure and the methods of control.
Right. Yeah, it's about control.
And ultimately, like, the potential for harm.
Absolutely.
Okay, so how does this scale work?
Well, it's a scale that ranges from 1 to 10,
Okay,
with 10 representing the highest level of danger.
got it.
Yeah.
So, like, where do some of the groups that we've been reading about fall on this scale?
Well, for example, Scientology receives a pretty high score.
Really?
Yeah, on average, it falls around a 7.27 on this Bonewitz scale.
Wow, 7.27.
Yeah, which places it firmly in that high danger category.
That's significant. That's really high.
It is.
So what is it about Scientology that gives it such a high score?
Well, a few things.
Okay.
One major factor is their emphasis on internal control.
Okay.
So they have a single leader, L. Ron Hubbard,
Uh-huh.
and his teachings are basically treated as absolute truth,
Interesting.
which leaves very little room for any dissent or critical thinking.
Right.
That type of rigid hierarchy is a big red flag.
Makes sense.
Also, there have been many reports that their recruitment methods can be quite aggressive.
Really?
Yeah, and there's also a history of financial exploitation. And there have even been allegations of Scientology trying to control members even after they've left the organization.
It's interesting because on the surface, they seem like, they're all about self-improvement and, like, spiritual enlightenment.
Right, and that's what makes it tricky.
Yeah.
They use this language that sounds really scientific.
Okay.
So much so that they're actually categorized as pseudo-rational in something called the integral model, which is basically a framework for understanding different levels of consciousness.
Wow.
Yeah, so they sort of disguise their tactics under the guise of science,
Right.
which makes them even harder to recognize.
That's so interesting because we always think of cults as being about, like, the belief system itself.
Right.
But it sounds like it's way more about
It's not just about what they believe.
the context.
It's about the power dynamics.
Yeah.
It's about the methods that they use to influence and control their members.
It's like the whole picture,
Exactly.
not just, like, the surface level.
And this is important because this stuff isn't limited to groups that we would typically label as cults.
That's true.
Manipulative tactics show up everywhere.
Okay, so this is where I think it gets really fascinating.
Yeah.
And kind of unsettling. When you start reading about everyday manipulation,
Right.
it's like manipulators are everywhere.
They are. They're more prevalent than we realize.
Yeah.
And they often target what we call soft targets.
Okay, soft targets.
Yeah.
So who are we talking about here?
Individuals with certain personality traits that make them more susceptible to being manipulated.
Okay, so, like, people pleasers, those who need constant approval,
Yes, you got it.
those who have, like, a hard time saying no,
Exactly.
are those the soft target?
Yeah, those are some classic signs.
Right.
And a lot of times these traits stem from like a deep-seated fear of rejection, abandonment, or conflict.
So someone who just hates conflict, like, avoids it at all costs,
Yes.
might be more likely to, like, just give in to a manipulator just to avoid a confrontation.
Precisely.
Even if they know, like, in their heart of hearts, they're being taken advantage of.
Exactly. It's all about avoiding that discomfort.
Yeah, yeah.
And manipulators are really good at sensing these vulnerabilities.
Right.
And then they exploit them.
So they're kind of like emotional predators in a way.
In a way, yeah.
Looking for like the weakest link.
They look for the easiest way in, yeah.
Yeah.
And they often use a system of rewards and punishments.
Okay.
So they might start by promising things like love, acceptance, success.
Right, to like lure you in.
Yeah, get you hooked.
Yeah.
But then they can quickly switch to threats.
Oh, wow.
Threats of loss like financial ruin, social isolation, damage to your reputation.
So it's like they get you in with the good stuff.
Right.
And then if you like step out of line,
Right. They flip the script.
they bring out the big guns.
Exactly. To
Yeah.
keep you in check.
It's interesting because we have some really good examples of this in our source material.
Oh, yeah.
Like the story of Jim and Sally
Oh, right, right.
and Sally's manipulative mother, Martha.
Yeah.
That was a perfect illustration of this.
So what happened there?
Like Martha would constantly guilt trip Sally into coming over for dinner every Friday night.
Oh,
Even though it caused all this friction in Sally's marriage to Jim,
classic manipulation tactic.
it was so classic.
She was using guilt and the fear of disappointing her mother to control Sally's behavior.
Right.
That's a very effective form of emotional blackmail,
Yeah.
especially for people who want to please others.
It's
really
right.
preys on those tendencies.
And then there was Francine's experience with her boss, Arnie.
Oh, Arnie, what a character.
Talk about a toxic workplace.
Tell me about it.
It was like this combination of charm and intimidation.
Oh, a classic combo.
Yeah,
A real Jekyll and Hyde situation.
exactly.
So what did he do?
Like, he would constantly undermine Francine's confidence,
Mm.
make her doubt herself and her perceptions.
Wow, that's rough.
And then, get this,
Mm.
he would lie about being in the office on weekends to create this, like, image of dedication.
Really?
When, in reality, he was having an affair.
No way! That's wild.
It was crazy.
So he was using this whole workaholic persona to cover up his infidelity.
Yeah,
That's messed up.
it was so messed up.
But it's a perfect example of using both gain and loss levers.
Right.
Like, he lured Francine in with these promises of career advancement.
The gain lever.
Exactly, making her think she was on the fast track.
Right.
But then as soon as she started questioning his behavior,
Yeah.
he switched tactics.
Oh, man.
He started using threats.
So he was like, if you don't keep quiet, you'll lose your job.
That's right, classic loss lever.
Wow.
He was trying to silence her by playing on her fear.
It's so insidious.
It is.
Because it's all happening in, like, seemingly normal settings.
That's the thing, it can happen anywhere.
Yeah, it's not always some, like, shadowy cult leader in a dark room.
Right, it can be your boss, your coworker, even a family member.
Yeah.
It can be anyone.
So what I'm really curious about is, like, how do they do it?
Well, they use these specific methods, these levers of control.
Tell me more about these levers of control.
They are fascinating, really. So, as we touched upon, there are two main categories: the levers of gain and the levers of loss.
Okay.
Manipulators are masters at pulling these levers,
Okay.
and they often start with the gain levers
Okay.
by dangling enticing things in front of you,
Right.
like love, acceptance, success, or even spiritual enlightenment.
Right, like we saw with Scientology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They want you to feel like you're on the path to something extraordinary,
Okay.
that you're special, chosen.
Right, right.
It's all about creating that sense of hope and possibility
Right.
to draw you in.
Okay, so they pull you in with a promise of gain.
Exactly.
But then what happens?
Well, if they sense any resistance from you,
Okay.
or they feel like you're starting to question their authority,
Mm-hmm.
they quickly switch tactics
Oh, I see.
and they start pulling those loss levers.
The loss levers, okay?
And that's where things can get really dark.
So this is where the threats come in,
Exactly.
like the threats of financial ruin or
Yes.
social isolation.
All those things you're afraid of losing.
Yeah.
They use that fear to keep you in line.
It's almost like they create this dependence
You're right. That's exactly what they're doing.
where you're so focused on like pleasing them
Yes.
and avoiding their disapproval
Absolutely.
that you just completely lose sight of your own needs and boundaries.
You lose yourself in the process.
And then you're trapped.
You become a puppet on their string,
Right.
dancing to their tune.
And it can be so hard to break free.
It can be incredibly difficult, especially if you've been under their influence for a long time.
Because by then, they've really got their hooks in you.
They've woven their web around you.
Right. And you've lost so much of yourself.
You've forgotten who you are without them.
Yeah.
That's the scariest part, really.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to pause for now.
Okay, sounds good.
And we'll pick up this conversation in the next part.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too.
It's almost like they create this dependence where you're so focused on pleasing them and avoiding their disapproval that you completely lose sight of your own needs and boundaries.
It's wild, isn't it?
It really is.
And the scariest part is they might not even realize they're doing it.
Right, exactly.
The source material talked about how some manipulators aren't even conscious of their behavior.
Yeah, it's not always some kind of like evil mastermind plan.
Right.
A lot of times it's a learned behavior.
Yep.
So like something they picked up from their family or early relationships.
So they might be repeating these patterns without even knowing it.
Exactly. They might not even recognize that they're doing it.
Okay, but that doesn't really make it any less damaging for the person on the receiving end, does it?
No, not at all.
Like, the impact is still the same.
Absolutely. Whether it's intentional or not, manipulation really does a number on you.
Yeah.
It undermines trust, erodes your self-esteem, creates these really unhealthy power dynamics.
So what can we do about it?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah. How do we resist these tactics, protect ourselves?
Well, the good news is there are strategies.
Okay, good.
One of the most important is setting clear boundaries.
Boundaries. Everyone's talking about boundaries these days, right?
It's true. Boundaries are essential.
So what does that actually look like in the context of, like, manipulation?
It means defining what you're willing to tolerate, what you're not.
Oh.
It means learning to say no without feeling guilty
Yeah.
and being willing to walk away from situations that are harmful.
So it's really about reclaiming your power.
Exactly. It's about taking back control of your life.
But that's easier said than done, right?
It can be, especially for people who tend to avoid conflict or like always try to please others.
Yeah.
But there's a really cool psychological principle called desensitization.
Desensitization. Okay.
It's basically about gradually exposing yourself to the things that trigger you, like someone's anger or disapproval.
So the idea is the more you face those things, the less power they have over you.
Exactly. You retrain your nervous system to be less reactive.
Interesting.
And as you become less reactive, you gain more control over your choices.
That makes sense.
The source material also highlighted the importance of developing an internal locus of control.
Right. Internal locus of control.
Yeah, that's the belief that you have agency over your own life.
As opposed to an external locus of control.
Exactly, where you feel like outside forces are in charge.
Right.
And manipulators love people with an external locus of control.
Oh, I see.
Because it makes them so much easier to manipulate.
It's like, if you already believe that you have no power,
Right.
then why would you even try to resist?
Exactly. You've already surrendered.
So part of resisting manipulation is recognizing that you have more power than you think.
It's about reclaiming that power
Yeah.
and stepping into your own authority.
It sounds so empowering.
It is.
But I imagine it's a process, right?
Absolutely. It's not an overnight transformation.
It's not like you just suddenly become immune to manipulation.
It takes time and effort.
The source material talked about something called correcting soft target thinking.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about identifying those beliefs that make you vulnerable
Right.
and consciously replacing them with more empowering ones.
So like instead of thinking I need to please everyone to be loved,
Exactly.
you start thinking my worth is inherent. I don't need to earn anyone's approval.
That's the shift we're talking about.
Wow, that's huge.
It is.
And I imagine that like sometimes that process involves ending relationships, right?
Sometimes.
Like it's
right?
not always about fixing things.
Right,
It's about
yeah,
prioritizing your own well-being.
Exactly. Sometimes walking away is the healthiest choice you can make.
The source material had a really powerful story about that.
Oh, yeah.
Cindy leaving Bob,
Oh, right.
despite Bob's attempts to manipulate her into staying.
Classic case of someone trying to guilt their partner into staying.
Bob was pulling out all the stops, like
Okay.
trying to make Cindy feel responsible for his happiness.
Oh, wow.
But Cindy was done.
Good for her.
She realized that staying in that relationship was destroying her sense of self.
It's so important to recognize when a relationship is no longer serving you.
And ultimately, walking away was the best thing for both of them.
It's amazing how sometimes ending a relationship can create space for something better.
Like you have to close one door to open another.
Exactly.
But, this brings up a question for me.
Okay.
How do you know when it's time to walk away?
That's a tough one, isn't it?
Because relationships have ups and downs, right?
The goo?
It's not always easy to tell if someone's just having a bad day
Right.
or if they're being manipulative.
That's a great point.
So how do you distinguish between those two things?
It's about looking for patterns.
Okay.
Are there consistent attempts to control your choices? guilt trips, threats.
So it's not just an isolated incident.
No, it's a recurring theme.
Okay.
And it's important to pay attention to how you feel.
Yeah.
If you consistently feel drained, anxious, or manipulated around someone,
That's a sign.
that's a huge red flag.
We've been focusing a lot on recognizing manipulation from others.
Right.
But what about those times when we might be contributing to the dynamic ourselves?
Oh, that's a really important point.
Like, I'm thinking about those soft target traits we talked about.
Yes.
It's not always just about the other person, right?
Absolutely not. We have to take responsibility for our own part in these dynamics.
So maybe that's a good place to start.
I think so.
Before we try to change anyone else, we need to understand our own patterns and vulnerabilities.
Self-awareness is key.
So how do we do that?
Well, it starts with being honest with ourselves.
Okay.
About those tendencies we might have.
To be manipulative.
To be manipulative, to be people-pleasing.
Right. To maybe even seek out those relationships where we can be controlled.
Exactly. Sometimes we unconsciously recreate those familiar dynamics.
It's like we're drawn to what we know, even if it's not healthy.
It's a strange paradox, isn't it?
It is.
But the first step is recognizing it.
And then what?
Then it's about making a conscious choice to change.
To break the cycle.
To break the cycle, exactly.
That sounds like a perfect segue into the next part of our conversation.
I think so too.
We've talked about how to resist manipulation from others
Yes.
and how to become more aware of our own tendencies.
Right.
But let's delve into those healthier ways of communicating.
I'm all for it.
How do we actually shift those patterns and build relationships based on authenticity, respect, and clear communication?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
But luckily, we have some answers.
So we've been talking about the importance of shifting from these manipulative patterns to healthier communication. But how do we actually do that? Like, what does that look like in real life?
Well, I think it starts with understanding the difference between manipulation and authentic communication, right? Because manipulation is all about trying to control someone, get them to do what you want.
Yeah.
And it often involves playing on their emotions, their insecurities.
Oh, it's like pushing their buttons.
Exactly. But authentic communication, that's a whole different ballgame.
Okay.
It's about being direct and respectful. It's about saying, hey, this is what I need, this is what I want, but also recognizing that the other person has the right to say no.
So it's not about trying to force your will on someone.
Nope, not at all. It's about collaboration, working together, finding a solution that works for both of you.
That makes sense. So can we talk about some specific examples of how this might play out, like in everyday situations?
Sure. Let's say you're feeling overwhelmed at work. You need help from a colleague.
Okay, yeah.
The manipulative approach would be to guilt trip them. You know, say something like, oh man, I'm drowning in work. I don't know how I'm going to get it all done. Looks like I'm going to be here all weekend.
Right, playing the martyr.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But the authentic approach would be to say, hey, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed with my workload right now. Would you be able to help me with this specific task?
Right. That's much more straightforward.
Right. You're not trying to make them feel bad. You're just being honest about what you need.
I like that. So it's about being direct, but also respectful.
Exactly. And it's not just about work situations. This applies to all kinds of relationships, like in romantic relationships. Instead of giving your partner the silent treatment to try and get their attention, you could say, hey, I'm feeling a little disconnected from you lately. Can we make some time to talk?
Right. That's so much healthier.
And it's the same with family. Instead of, I don't know, giving your parents the cold shoulder because they don't agree with your choices, you can have an honest, open conversation with them. Even if you don't agree in the end, at least you've communicated respectfully.
It sounds like authentic communication requires a lot of vulnerability
You know, it does.
because you're putting yourself out there. You're being honest about your needs and your feelings, and that can be scary.
Yeah, it can be really scary, especially if you've been hurt before. But here's the thing. Vulnerability, that's the key to real connection.
Right.
When we're willing to be open and honest, that's when we create those deep, meaningful relationships.
This has been an amazing conversation. Like, I feel like we've really gone deep on this topic. We've talked about the dangers of cults, the ways manipulation shows up in everyday lives, and most importantly, how to start creating healthier, more authentic relationships.
And it's all about taking that first step.
So to our listener, I hope you feel empowered to start building those relationships.
Remember, it starts with you. Take the time to understand your own patterns, set those boundaries, and most importantly, communicate honestly and respectfully.
And keep diving deep.